August 18th, 1940, Southern England. The hottest day. The sky over Kent is chaos. Clouds of black smoke twist between spirals of vapor trails as Spitfires and Messerschmitts claw at each other high above the English countryside. The roar of engines mixes with the chatter of machine guns, the air thick with the smell of burning oil. Flight Lieutenant Johnnie Allen of No. 54 Squadron pulls his Spitfire into a hard climb, the Merlin engine screaming. Is locked onto a German fighter, its silver fuselage glinting in the sun. He squeezes the trigger. Nothing. The guns jam. He banks sharply, rolls over, dives to escape. But then it happens. As his nose points down, the engine coughs. Once. Twice. Then it dies completely. Allen slams the throttle forward. "Come on. Come on, you bastard," he shouts. The Merlin doesn't respond. Fuel floods the carburetor, choking the engine. The propeller spins uselessly as the Spitfire tumbles through the clouds. His falling fast, 2,000 feet, frantically trying to restart the engine as the altimeter needle plunges. At the last second, the engine sputters back to life. He levels out just above the treetops, his heart hammering in his chest. When he lands back at Hornchurch, his hands are still shaking. It wasn't flak. It wasn't enemy fire. His own aircraft had betrayed him. And is not alone. Across the country, WWII pilots are reporting the same thing. Every time they push their Spitfires or Hurricanes into a steep dive, the Merlin engine cuts out. The Germans know it too. While British pilots fight gravity, the Luftwaffe's fuel-injected Bf-109s dive without fear, lining up clean shots before climbing away untouched. One WWII mechanic writes in his logbook that summer, "The problem isn't the man, it's the machine." At Rolls-Royce, engineers tear apart carburetors, searching for the flaw. They test and retest. Nothing seems to work. Until a young woman in coveralls, her hands stained with oil, hair tied under a scarf, walks into the lab with a brass fitting no bigger than a coin. Her name is Beatrice Schilling, and her idea will change the war. Outside the factory in Farnborough, the air smells of cordite and coffee. Bombers drone somewhere far off, muffled by the night sky. Inside, the Royal Aircraft establishment hums with the sound of typewriters, lathes, and the constant ticking of clocks. Beatrice works in the engine testing division, one of the few women engineers in a building filled with men who still glance twice when she speaks. She doesn't care. She's here for the machines. Always has been. A trained mechanic and racing motorcyclist, she knows the Merlin inside and out. And what she's been hearing from the pilots gnaws at her. Every time a Spitfire dives, gravity pulls fuel away from the carburetor. The engine floods. It starves, then chokes, then dies. The enemy's fuel injection system doesn't have this weakness. The solution must be simple, mechanical, elegant. She takes home blueprints and sketches late into the night under the dim light of a desk lamp. The hum of bombers overhead a constant reminder that time is running out. On her workbench sits a brass disc, drilled clean through the center. Not a replacement for the carburetor, but a restriction, something to control how fuel moves under pressure. She files the edges smooth, tests the bore with a caliper, and smiles. It shouldn't work, but maybe it will. A few weeks later, she's in a hangar with two engineers and an RAF test pilot. The Merlin engine roars on the stand, shaking the floor. Beatrice adjusts her goggles, tightens the fitting she's built into the carburetor, and nods to the pilot. "Take her up." The Spitfire lifts off into the pale morning light, circling once before the pilot banks sharply and dives. Everyone watches, breath held. No sputter, no stall. The engine holds. When the aircraft lands, the pilot jumps out, grinning from ear to ear. "Whatever you did," he shouts over the noise, "you've just saved our bloody lives." Beatrice doesn't cheer. She just nods, half smiling. It's not magic, she says. It's math. That small brass disc will become famous across the RAF. It will be called, with equal parts respect and mischief, Miss Schilling's orifice. And soon, she'll be on the road herself, delivering it by hand to every Spitfire squadron in Britain, racing between airfields under the shadow of the Blitz, armed with nothing but a toolkit and an idea that should have been impossible. October 1940. RAF Biggin Hill. The wind cut across the airfield like a knife, carrying the distant rumble of London burning. The night raids had been relentless that week. The sky over the city still smeared black with smoke. Mechanics worked by torchlight, their breath fogging the air as they patched bullet holes and replaced canopies shattered by flak. Down the line, among the bent wings and oil drums, a small van rattled to a stop. The side door slid open, and out stepped a woman in coveralls, a leather satchel slung across her shoulder. Her hair was tucked beneath a scarf, goggles hanging from her neck. "Morning, lads," she called, voice calm, clipped, unmistakably confident. Every mechanic stopped. A few pilots looked up from their tea. Standing there, boots crunching on frozen gravel, was Beatrice Tilly Schilling, senior engineer from Farnborough, and the only person in Britain who'd brought an entire fighter command to a standstill with a piece of brass no bigger than a shilling. In her satchel, wrapped in brown paper and labeled in her neat handwriting, were dozens of small metal discs. Each one was drilled, polished, and measured by hand. She didn't wait for introductions. "Where's your line, Chief?" she asked. The hangar smelled of fuel and sweat. Mechanics crowded around as she removed her gloves and set one of her inventions on the workbench. "This," she said, tapping the brass washer, "is going to stop your Merlins from choking themselves to death." One of the older mechanics frowned. "You're saying that little thing's going to fix what Rolls-Royce couldn't?" Beatrice smiled thinly. "I'm saying it already has." She showed them the carburetor drawing, the flaw everyone had missed. When a Spitfire dived, the G-forces forced fuel out of the float chamber, flooding the engine. The solution wasn't more power. It was control. "This restrictor," she explained, "slows the flow just enough to stop the flooding. It doesn't rob you of fuel. It regulates it." The men exchanged skeptical looks. Beatrice shrugged, wiped her hands on a rag, and gestured toward a parked Spitfire. "Right then. Let's fit one and prove it." An hour later, the Merlin engine roared to life. The air vibrated. Beatrice stood with her arms folded as the pilot ran through the checks. The smell of high-octane fuel stung her nose. Then, with a wave from the ground crew, the Spitfire lifted off, climbing gracefully into the pale sky. It leveled, then dropped into a knee-vertical dive. Every mechanic tensed. The sound of the engine deepened but didn't cut. The plane pulled up smoothly, looping into a climb and rolling level again. When it landed, the pilot leapt out, pulling off his flight helmet. "It worked," he shouted, laughing. No sputter, no stall. She held all the way down. Beatrice grinned for the first time that day. "Good. Let's fit the rest." For the next 3 months, she became a one-woman convoy, driving from base to base, her van loaded with tools, parts, and a bicycle strapped to the back for when the roads were impassable from bomb damage. She worked in freezing hangars and muddy fields, surrounded by tired men who had been awake for days patching the same planes over and over. She never complained. At night, when the air raid sirens wailed, she would cover her ears, wait out the bombing in a shelter, then go straight back to the engines. Her reward wasn't medals or headlines. It was the sound of a Merlin holding steady through a dive, the purr of a machine she'd helped save. December 1940. Somewhere over the channel. Flight Lieutenant Peter Brothers banked hard after a fleeing Messerschmitt. The German pilot broke into a dive, nose down, racing for the cloud cover below. Brothers followed. The Spitfire screamed, the G-forces pressing him into the seat, but the engine never faltered. At 5,000 feet, he squeezed the trigger. 2 seconds later, the 109 exploded in a ball of fire. Back at base, he told his ground crew, "I don't know what they did to the carburetor, but tell whoever fixed it, they've just won us back the sky." The message made its way up the chain, and eventually, to a quiet office in Farnborough, where Beatrice was bent over a workbench, cleaning her tools. She didn't look up when the telegram arrived, but she smiled as she read it. Miss Schilling. Pilots report no engine stalls and dive tests. Immediate request for 1,000 units. Air Ministry thanks you for your ingenuity. She folded the message neatly and tucked it into her pocket. There was still work to do, because while the skies were safer now, the war wasn't over, and her little brass ring had just become one of the most important secrets in Britain. January 1941, Farnborough, England. The Royal Aircraft Establishment was a world of noise and motion. Sparks from lathes danced in the air, drills whined, and the steady hum of engines filled every corridor. Outside, the airfield was crusted in frost, the white runways stretching into fog. But inside, Beatrice Schilling's corner of the workshop was warm, the scent of oil and brass mixing with tea gone cold beside her lathe. She stood over her workbench, sleeves rolled, goggles perched on her forehead. The brass restrictors were lined up neatly beside her, dozens of perfect circles, gleaming under the fluorescent light. Each one was hand-finished, each one measured to within a fraction of a millimeter. A journalist might have called it ingenious. Beatrice called it math and patience. The problem had been brutal in its simplicity, a carburetor that couldn't handle gravity. Her answer, in the end, was equally simple, a tiny orifice that controlled the surge of fuel under negative G-forces. It wasn't a redesign or breakthrough in chemistry. It was a correction, the kind of elegant fix that made the impossible look obvious in hindsight. As she worked, the door to the lab opened. Her supervisor, a short man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped inside holding a letter stamped with the RAF crest. "They want another 1,000, Miss Schilling." Beatrice didn't stop polishing the brass. "Good," she said. "Tell them I'll need another pair of hands and more biscuits." The man smiled faintly. "They're calling it Miss Schilling's orifice, you know." Beatrice froze for a moment, smirked, and said, "Then at least they'll remember who made it." By spring, every Spitfire and Hurricane in service carried her invention. Pilots who'd once cursed their engines now dove through clouds with confidence, roaring after the Luftwaffe with the kind of aggression Britain hadn't seen since the war began. Reports poured in from across the country. The new carburetors were flawless. Dogfights that had once ended in flame now ended in victory. The engineers at Farnborough knew her name, but the country didn't. Her fix was classified, her contribution buried under layers of military secrecy. She didn't seem to mind. When asked years later what she thought of her achievement, she shrugged and said, "It was a bit of common sense, really." But in the quiet corridors of the Air Ministry, the truth was understood. Without Beatrice Schilling's brass ring, the RAF's most iconic aircraft might have been outmatched before the war even began. April 1941, RAF Tangmay. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of day that turned contrails into white ribbons against a blue sky. A squadron of Spitfires took off in perfect formation, sunlight flashing off their wings. On the ground, Beatrice stood with her arms folded, watching. She'd come to see the results for herself, not in a laboratory, not on a test bench, but in the air. One of the pilots, a young man with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes, walked up beside her. You're the woman who fixed the Merlins, aren't you? She smiled. I helped. He offered his hand. Then you've saved more of us than you'll ever know. Beatrice shook his hand, her grip firm, the faint trace of engine oil still on her palm. You're the ones doing the hard part, she said. I just made sure your machines would listen to you. The pilot grinned, then jogged toward his aircraft. Moments later, the roar of engines filled the sky. The squadron climbed in perfect arcs, sunlight flashing across their canopies as they vanished into the clouds. Beatrice watched until the sound faded, her expression unreadable. In the distance, the air raid sirens began to wail again. Back in London, the Blitz still raged. Night after night, the Germans tried to bone Britain into submission. And night after night, the RAF rose to meet them, their Spitfires and Hurricanes faster, steadier, deadlier than ever. Historians would later call it a small victory of science over chaos. But for the pilots who lived through it, it was simpler than that. It was a victory built by hands like Beatrice's, that worked through exhaustion and fear to give them one more edge, one more chance to come home. 1942, a new challenge. By the time America entered the war, Beatrice had moved on to fuel injection systems, jet engines, and aerodynamic testing. She was no longer just the woman with the wrench. She was one of Britain's foremost engineers, though few outside the Air Ministry would ever know her name. Yet the legend of Miss Schilling's orifice followed her wherever she went. Pilots carried brass copies as good luck charms. Mechanics joked that she'd done what the Luftwaffe couldn't, make every Spitfire pilot fall in love with a piece of engineering. When asked once if she ever found the nickname embarrassing, she just laughed. It worked, didn't it? Years later, long after the war, Beatrice would sit in her garden with her husband, also an engineer, polishing her old motorcycle. The same one she used to race on weekends, the same one that taught her to trust the feel of an engine under pressure. Someone once said that the Battle of Britain was won by courage, radar, and the Merlin engine. But every pilot who survived a steep dive knew there was one more ingredient. A brass ring designed by a woman who refused to accept that good enough was ever good enough. The Luftwaffe had their aces, their factories, their fuel-injected precision. Britain had something smaller, stranger, and far more enduring. A tiny orifice that made the impossible fly. END